Okay, I am going to try to do something a little different today in talking about what you need to do. And um, I found myself getting somewhat frustrated. I have been getting frustrated and more as I read the blogs because I feel like people are making them more complicated than they need to be, and also avoiding doing what I keep trying to ask you to do, which is to actually read the text and use the blog to make sure you understand it. The reason I'm getting so frustrated is that when I read people's blogs, I feel like I am reading the tracks of all the Google searches that you have been doing. Sometimes those tracks are documented, more likely they are not. Um, and I just find that extremely troublesome for a variety of reasons. Now, I get it. This is a very big book. It is intimidating. I weighed it this morning. It is 5.6 pounds. And that is a big book. The pages, there are 1,700 pages in it. And we've been dealing with great authors like Aristotle, Gorgias, Plato, and Cicero. And later we'll be dealing with other more recent but equally famous sorts of people. And you feel kind of overwhelmed at trying to figure out what to do. But why shouldn't you do it this way? First of all, and I know you all know this, sources should be documented. If you've used something out of Wikipedia, you've got to tell me you did it. Secondly, and this is probably why it's so obvious when people are using things that, um, as opposed to reading the text, the sources aren't necessarily focusing on what we're focusing on. And every time I start reading something that doesn't seem to even relate to the conversation, all I need to do is Google and look in Wikipedia, and I usually find that that's where this came from. Cutting and pasting doesn't teach you very much. You all know that. The whole point about writing is that it can be a mode of learning. And finally, you're wasting time that could be better spent reading the theory itself. So I'm going to make an argument today, and that is you need to return to the text itself. That's what I'm asking you to do when I ask you to do a blog. As it says here, the purpose of the blog is to help you understand and to use writing as a way of understanding. What are the sections that I usually put in the blog? Well, I have this basic framework, and then I have realized that I need to kind of give you a better focus as you're reading, so that I've added a comment like, for Cicero, make sure you understand what makes good rhetoric and why rhetoric is good, and stasis theory and his stuff about arrangement. When I say an outline of the argument being made, this doesn't need to be a formal outline, just identify what's going on in the sections. That could be your notes as you go through it, and I'm going to show you my notes in a minute. When I say a short summary of the theory of rhetoric in the reading, what I'm asking you to say is, what he thinks rhetoric is. A theory is a framework for describing something. And each of these rhetoricians have a general theory about rhetoric, and they may also have some sub-theories about pieces of rhetoric. The thing about Cicero is that he covers a whole bunch of different things. There's an overall theory, which is actually what makes rhetoric good rhetoric and why rhetoric is good. And then there are some sub things in the sections I've asked you to read, specifically that cover stasis theory and arrangement. I put in this little note here that you should put your text away because the summary, in fact, the whole thing should be in your words. You might decide you're going to use a quote, but when you're writing this, just put that original aside and write it and put a little placeholder where you think you're going to put a quote. Pick a passage that you like. It's best if you pick a passage that connects somehow with the rest of it. And so that you can use this selection of a passage to help you make sense of what the author is saying. And finally, an application of this theory to some piece of rhetoric. And I've mentioned this before, don't go out and Google and find all these articles and theses, etc., where people are applying these theories. I don't want to see what these people have said. I want to see what you do in taking something you know and applying the theory to. It doesn't have to be great speeches, although, as I've mentioned, there are great speeches available in that American Rhetoric link in the Rhetoric online resources. Pick a song, pick a favorite game, pick the most recent political brouhaha that's going on. Pick something you know and just apply the idea. Now, in the case of Cicero, I basically said, pick a discord, identify its status, and analyze how or if it includes the 6 parts of classical arrangement. So, pick a speech of Trump. Say what the stasis is. What is the source of the argument? And say, of course, they're usually so brief, it probably doesn't have the 6 parts of classical arrangement, but say which ones of the 6 parts of classical arrangement it has. So right now I want to kind of go over Cicero and talk about how I went about taking notes on his invention and make some suggestions to help you in taking notes when you're reading. The first thing, and this applies to everybody, anybody you read, pay attention to sort of the structure and the clues that the author gives you. In the case of Cicero, the whole book is divided into Roman numeral sections. And I don't know if that's his dividing or some later person, but for whatever, we've got these divisions. And notice the clues for organizing. So now I'm going to go over this pretty fast. It took me a little time to figure out what was going on. But basically, I saw that the first 4 sections, sections 1 through 4, he's discussing eloquence and wisdom. He's talking about how rhetoric requires both eloquence and wisdom. Eloquence without wisdom, he basically says, is useless. I mean, this is a great quotation. This, by the way, would be the quotation I would pick, because, and then he describes some of the abuses of rhetoric in his own time. And it's descriptions that uh, that are accurate to the descriptions of some of the rhetoric in our current time. At the end of section 4, he has a transition. And that is on page 261. And right before he starts section 5, he says at the end, before I speak of the rules of oratory, I think I should say something about the nature of the art itself, about its function, its end, its materials, and its divisions. So here is a great transition passage to help you in reading. What it's telling you is that a little bit later, there's going to be something about the rules of oratory. So that gives you a clue. Look for those rules of oratory. And it tells you that for at least section 5 and who knows what, he's going to talk about the nature of the art of oratory itself. Now, you may not even know what the heck he means by the nature of oratory itself. But you know that the thing that's coming is going to be about the nature of the art of oratory itself. Then you look at section 5, and he starts it with, there's a scientific system of politics, which includes many important departments. One of these departments is eloquence, based on the rules of art, which they call rhetoric. Okay, so he's going to talk about rhetoric, and it turns out rhetoric is a subset of political theory, which tells you something important about the role of rhetoric, he says. And you go down and you're thinking, you're seeing what he's talking about, and you see that he says at the end of the paragraph that starts 362, to cite one example, Gorgias of Leontini, almost the earliest teacher of oratory, held that the orator could speak better than anyone else on all subjects. Now, we already read that thing that Gorgias had said. So that is, just an aside, that would be a useful thing to remind yourself about what Gorgias had actually said. Apparently, he assigned to the professional a vast and, in fact, infinite material. Now, notice that he used the word apparently. That's usually kind of a symbol of being a little bit cynical about something. Then he describes what Aristotle describes. Aristotle, on the other hand, who did much to improve and adorn this art, thought the function of the orator was concerned with 3 classes of subjects: epideictic, deliberative, and judicial. Again, he's writing about something you've read about already. So it appears that what he's doing is going through a history of what earlier rhetoricians have said is rhetoric. So the beginning of 5 talks about how he sees it as a subset of politics. Then he talks about Gorgias's idea and then Aristotle's idea. Section 6 starts with Hermogoras, who happens to be more of his contemporary. For Hermogoras, indeed, does not seem to notice what he says or understand what he promises when he divides the material of the order into special cases and general questions. All right, so he's moved a step beyond the sort of somewhat cynical aside about Gorgias. He is directly criticizing Hermogoras. Hermogoras does not seem to notice what he says or understand what he promises. And then he goes on at some detail about what's wrong with Hermogoras, although in the process, he does say he likes his textbook, which sets out some principles. Is it important for me to totally understand why he doesn't like Hermogoras? No. I'm just going to put it to my side. And he doesn't really like Hermogoras, and I'm going to focus on what he does like and what he does want to say. And it's good that I'm doing that because at the beginning of section 7, he has one of his typical transitions. Therefore, the material of the art of rhetoric seems to be that which we said Aristotle approved. So this is what happened. At the end of 4, he said, before I speak of the rules of oratory, I should say something about the nature of oratory itself. That is, what is its theory? What is rhetoric? Then he goes through, he says it's a subset of politics. He says, this is what Gorgias thought, and this is what Aristotle thought, and this is what Hermogoras thought. And then he says, well, the right one here is Aristotle, not Gorgias and not Hermogoras. So at that point, he is returning to this basic point, which was basically to give a textbook about the material of the art of rhetoric. He says in section 7, here are the parts: invention, arrangement, expression, memory, delivery. And then he says, I'm going to start talking about invention. So you know from that he is about to start talking about these things, and you can look ahead and see whether he continues to talk about that or changes to a new topic. At this point, I'm going to shift so that we look at the actual text itself. And the beginning of 263 starts with the description. And are we recording? We're still recording. So my internet went out for a little bit. I'm not quite sure how this will show up later on. But the top of 263 starts with his little description of those 5 steps of rhetoric. These are called the 5 canons. And he says, now that these terms have been defined briefly, we shall postpone to another time the discussion in which we would explain the nature, the end, and the function of the art, for they require lengthy treatment and are not so intimately connected with the description of the art and the transmission of the rules. So here we have another transition statement. He's given us a brief summary of those things, but he's not going to cover them all in detail because it doesn't relate to what he wants to do, which is the rules of the rhetoric itself, I think. So he's talking about his book of rhetoric. I think I should treat material and divisions together. Therefore, let us consider what the character of invention should be. This is the most important of all the divisions, and above all is used in every kind of pleading. Now, I should stop and note that in a lot of his examples, he's thinking about rhetoric from the situation of a judicial setting, a pleading for a case. Remember, he liked Aristotle's division into the 3 big, large genres of epideictic, deliberative, and judicial. Those 3 big, large categories of rhetoric are descriptions of the 3 main contexts in which rhetoric occurs in ancient and classical times. And that's where he's going to get all of his examples. So most of his examples come from either the judicial situation or sometimes the deliberative situation, very rarely the epideictic. So this is a transition. He is about to talk about invention. To go back, we've got these 5 canons: invention, arrangement, expression, memory, and delivery. And now he's going to focus on invention. Section 8 is where he starts talking about stasis. Note, by the way, that I write on my text. So this is where he talks about stasis. So I note stasis. He also calls it issue, controversy. I'm not sure what that is. A controversy over, and then fact, definition, nature, which he also explains as the quality of it. And then I do another list up here: fact, definition, quality, procedure. So one of the things I'm trying to learn here are what are his stasis categories. And one of the ways I do that is I write them out. Notice, just looking at the page, that I have circled it every time he uses that one of those categories. So in other words, he helps me process what is pretty complicated text. So at section 8 is where he starts with the stasis. Every subject which contains in itself a controversy to be resolved by speech and debate involves a question about a fact, or about a definition, or about the nature of an act, or about legal processes. The question then, from which the whole case arises, is called constitutio, or the issue. Now, you might wonder what this 13 says. And you read down, and it says, constitutio is a translation of the Greek term, and then they give you the Greek term, and was supplanted in Cicero's later writings by the word status. So this is where he starts talking about stasis theory, or status. And as I said, in later writings, he had slightly different terminology. This question then, from which the whole case arises, is called constitutio, or the issue. The issue is the first conflict of pleas which arise from the defense or answer to our accusation. Again, the legal setting in a way. In this way, you did it, I did not do it, or I was justified in doing it. When the dispute is about a fact, the issue is said to be conjectural, because the plea is supposed to be by conjecture or inferences. When the issue is about a definition, it is called the definitional issue, because the force of the term must be defined in words. Then he goes through and says quality and procedure. And if you're like me, you don't really get what he's talking about yet. But luckily, he's going to explain some more. So in the paragraph that starts with, that's 11, as to the dispute about fact, this can be assigned to any time, for the question can be what has been done, did Ulysses kill Axis, what is being done? So in other words, we could argue about a fact. We could say, you killed this person. And the other person could say, no, I did not kill this person. That would be a fact. Did Ulysses kill Ajax? Is a question of fact. Presumably, you can debate about it and give evidence that will show whether or not Ulysses did kill Ajax. What is being done? That is a question about fact. So we could have an argument about the pandemic and what is being done to help the pandemic. That can be a question of fact. Did Trump do X? Did Trump do Y? Did the governor of Arkansas do X? Did the governor of Florida do Y? As you know, we have had a lot of disputes in our current society right now about the facts. One person says this is what happened, and another person says that is what happened. Unless you go out and do a whole lot of research, you sometimes do not know. But that's the basic, that can be the basic argument. The controversy about a definition is in the next paragraph. And he explains that sort of the basic strategy that you go through in using these for invention. So once you've figured out whether something happened or not, and if you've decided that that's the real controversy, did it happen or didn't it happen, then you stop there. But if you decide that it's clear what happened, people are not disputing the facts, you can go to the next type, and that's definition. And his example, for example, is if a sacred article is purloined from a private house, is the act to be adjudged theft or sacrilege? So the idea here is that there's agreement on the facts. Something was taken from a private house, but there's not agreement how you would characterize that. That is, how you would define that act. And the example he gives is you could call it sacrilege or you could call it theft. What's the consequence of calling it those different things? Well, if you start calling it sacrilege, then your argument is focused on a religious issue. If you call it theft, then your argument is focused on a judicial issue that ought to be dealt with in the courts. So how you define something will affect what you do later. In legal settings, one of the things you can do that we do all the time is we define acts by level. So for example, if somebody kills somebody, you can of course dispute whether or not they did kill him. But then the next thing you can do is, yes, they agree that so-and-so killed the other person. But the question is, was it murder or was it self-defense? Calling it murder versus calling it self-defense is a definitional argument that people can dispute about. So here's my notes from this page. So section 8 is on invention. And I'm just putting in my notes, fact, definition, quality, processes. Then he talks about disputes over facts, i.e. did Ulysses kill Ajax, and disputes over definition, e.g. is it theft or sacrilege. Now I put those examples in there because they help me understand the points that he's trying to make. At this point, on page 264, you see how he's moving to quality, and that paragraph is all about quality. And then he starts talking about Hermogenes divided this genus into 4 species: deliberative, epideictic, equitable, and legal. Well, I really don't know what the heck he's talking about because I haven't read Hermogenes or these particulars, but I remember that he didn't really like Hermogenes earlier. And I think he says, I think I ought to criticize this error of his. So he apparently is going into some kind of long digression where he criticizes the approach that Hermagoras does to quality. And I'm just going to skip over it, therefore, until he gets back to the point that I'm interested in. And it's all genera or genus. I think he's trying to like put epideictic, etc., those three genres under qualitative, or else put qualitative under those. And note that I don't have much of the way of notes, but that at the bottom of page 264, he's got on section 9, he has this big therefore. He goes into this long digression criticizing Hermagoras, who tried to integrate stasis with the three genera, and ends up saying Hermagoras is wrong. And then in 11, he has this another transition. Therefore, let's talk about the qualitative issues. Now, at that point, he goes into his own dividing of things. And says there are two types, the equitable and legal. Equitable relates to justice and law relates to the rules set out by the community. So what was qualitative? Qualitative is evaluating. You're evaluating the quality of some kind of act or event or whatever. And he's saying that there are two kinds of evaluation schemes, two sets of criteria really that we use. One having to do with justice. Is this a just thing to do? And one having to do with law. Is this illegal? And as we all know, justice and law are not always the same. So then he starts dividing each of those up into subdivisions. And I, again, decide I'm just going to kind of skip over that till it gets to the fourth stasis, the procedural stasis, also known as translative, which is what to do about it. At that point, I realize in section 10, which is I'm sorry, 12, which is on page 265, in the middle of the second column. We have explained the issues and their divisions, that is those four, but it would seem that we can give instances of each type more conveniently when we give a store of arguments for each one. So in other words, he is now starting over again on the four types and going to give not just examples, which is what he did on the version he just did before. Now he's going to give the types of arguments people can have about this if that's the issue. And that's one of the things that's probably most foreign to us about Aristotle and Cicero. It gets at this issue of topics, which we kind of skimmed over when we looked at Aristotle. But what they're saying is, if this is your topic, then here are the types of questions that you might want to ask. And we've seen this kind of approach, modern life, in what's called heuristics. That what are some heuristics that you can use so that you can find out all of the things about a topic. Probably the most common heuristic you're aware of is the reporter's 5 W's. So we say, use the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, and how, to explore the topic in as much detail as you can. The idea behind all this is, instead of just going with the first thing that comes into your mind, try to be thorough and think through the argument. And what the teaching of writing and speaking was in a lot of the classical time, and we'll see as it goes through into the later times, it involved teaching students these common issues that come up so that they can, whatever the topic, ask questions about it and go systematically through and ask the questions that you need to, so that you can find all the available means of persuasion. One here that he introduced is one that you're really probably familiar with: comparison. So a lot of times when you are arguing something, you compare it. You might compare it as something good, something bad. You might have multiple points, multiple options. There may be a good way to do it and a cheap way to do it, and you might compare those. But so comparison is just a natural human strategy for trying to understand something. We think about how what's a good strategy for solving a problem, and we compare it to another problem that we've had, and we use that as a way to generate ideas or invent. That's what invention means. So let me go back to the beginning. How should you draft the reading blogs in Rhetoric 7311? The first thing is, it's okay to go out on and Google, see if you can find some other things that will help you. It might be a good starting point, but don't stop there. Go back to the text and work with the text. If you find something out there on the web that's useful, take it with you as sort of in your toolbox for thinking about the material. But focus on what I'm asking you to focus. Does it help you in trying to explain the particular theory that we're talking about? As in Cicero, the particular theory I want you to become aware of is the stasis theory and the arrangement. With that, I think I'll stop here. I don't mean to sound like a nagging mother, although having been a mother for 27 years, I now know how that feels. But I want you to try to use your time efficiently and wisely. And the most efficient use of your time is to look at the text, see what clues are in the text, use your writing abilities, your note-taking abilities to figure out what they're saying. If there's some section that you don't get, just jump over to the next. But there's always going to be these hooks that you can get onto. As I was showing you with Cicero, he continually provides these transition things that help you know what he's trying to talk about right there. Use those hooks to get you through the text. So with that, I'm going to end and hope you have a great day. Please go back, work on the Cicero and Quintilian blogs. I think we are going to keep working on Cicero and Quintilian this week. We are not going to jump to the discussions until the week that follows. So I will see you online. Bye-bye.